All right, good morning, Doug. We have something kind of interesting to talk about today relating to Sri Lanka. And as we were talking about before this call started, the thing that's most interesting about it, I think, to me, is that this is kind of a preview of things to come. So we'll get into a speech that the new prime minister just made. But first, I'd like to show folks, I don't think you've seen this either yet, this little video of something of what's been going on there lately. And specifically, this is, I don't know if you can see it on the screen, this video from Twitter. This is the former prime minister's car collection. Very nice.
Cool. Looks like he's a fan of Lamborghinis.
Yeah, that's what they look like now, though, Doug. They set them all on fire. So there's a lot of frustration among the Sri Lankans, apparently, due to shortages and mismanagement of the government. And so this prime minister was replaced with someone new who came out with a very interesting speech the other day. And we just kind of like to go through some of the major points of this. And I'll just start, Doug, by with the point that shocked me right out of the gates about the whole thing. Shows gross mismanagement by the government. No surprise. It was that they had foreign exchange reserves in November of 2019 of about $7.5 billion. And as of today, they have trouble putting together even a single million US dollars. Can't even get $1 million together.
That's just amazing. I mean, for a government, that's like America not being able to, incidentally, I understand there are millions of Americans that couldn't do that if they had to anyway. But I'm not sure how much broad news coverage Sri Lanka has gotten in the US or Europe. Do you have an idea of how many people actually know about this place?
It seems almost none at all. If you look in the mainstream media, certainly in the above the fold in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, or any other major newspaper or the websites, it just doesn't really rank there. So it's certainly among all the news in the world, this is an afterthought.
Okay, so it's the big island off the south coast of India, and it's kind of got an interesting history. It's been a British possession basically for 250 years. So English is the kind of lingua franca in the country, but within the country, it's been in a state of active race war for many, many decades between a group called the Tamils in North India, in North Sri Lanka, and who are Hindus, Buddhists, and are more or less more native. And how these two groups formed. And of course, 10% of the population are Muslims in addition, and about another 5 or 8% or something like that are Christians. So with these primitive tribal people, and I think it's fair to say that they are primitive and tribal based on the way they're acting and the way their government's been run for a long time. Ethnic and distinctions are really, really important. I mean, they really draw the dividing line in these countries. Oh, just to go on a little
especially
bit more. Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
I was going to say, especially when they're under stress, when the stress of these rising prices, fuel shortages, all of that, those dividing lines become critically important.
Exactly. It evolves to the lowest common denominator is what happens. So historically, so the place was a British colony and kind of more or less well run for a long period of time. And the British essentially turned it into a tea plantation. It's about the only thing that they produce there is they do cheap fabric sewing. You might even have some cheap rags in your closet that were turned out in Sri Lanka, and tea. most of the tea in the world seems to come from Sri Lanka. So that's all they do. And the other income of the country, this is kind of typical, exporting agricultural products and exporting people who then send remittances back to the country. That's huge for them. And foreign aid, another huge source of income for them, and tourism, because it's very, very cheap. So they get lots of tourism. But of course, they've destroyed the tourist industry with all this violence.
Well, in the last 2 years of COVID, really I mean, it was under, like most of the world, under a lockdown of sorts. That for the last 2 years have starved of tourist dollars as well.
Exactly. But even today, when you look at current video newsreels of what's going on, it seems like about half the people are still wearing COVID masks for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this kind of reminds me of the most recent thing that Giant Bhandari has done. And I suggest our subscribers Google Giant, who was on the show. Giant's an Indian, and he spends a lot of time in India, but he absolutely hates the subcontinent. He actually believes, and he may be right, that the average IQ in the subcontinent, and that would include Sri Lanka, is about 80. Because the smartest people have all left in disgust. So it's really degraded what's left. So in any event, you could tell things were going to go badly. I used to collect stamps, which is how I first became familiar with Sri Lanka. I became familiar with what was called Ceylon. And whenever a country changes its name, that's almost always a tip-off to something going wrong. It's when the Congo changed its name from Congo to Zaire. You knew something was happening, and it was. When Burma changed its name to Myanmar, the place was on the slippery slope, and it absolutely was. And the same thing happened with Sri Lanka. And on research, the place has always been run like a feudal autocracy. And I say feudal because there are relatively few families in Ceylon that have always controlled the place economically and politically. And there used to be a family called the Bandaranaques, who were actually criminally insane and ruled the country for 20 years and almost totally destroyed it, and tried their own path to socialism. All these dog shit countries try their peculiar paths to socialism. And among other things, the Bandaranaques, in order to become popular, offered free food. I've got a dog here. This is my Ukrainian bar girl. I'll consult with her later about what's going on in Kiev. She's got
connections.
Problem with her sister, who is a Russian sympathizer. Anyway, that's a different podcast. Anyway, the Bandaranaques ran the country into the ground for 20 years and greatly enriched themselves. And now the current family, which has also been very powerful for a long time, is called the Rajapaksas.
Rajapaksas,
is that right? Yep. Yes. Okay, and these people are criminally insane as well. One thing about the background of the country is that Arthur C. Clarke, the famous science fiction writer, lived there for many, many years. And after Sri Lanka, Ceylon changed its name to Sri Lanka, they promoted a law to induce, believe it or not, never met him personally, to induce people like him to come and live there and spend money and draw attention to what a neat place it was and all this type of thing. So, in any event, they had a foreign residence law encouraging rich foreigners to come there, and Arthur C. Clarke promoted the place. But then what happened is that this long-standing fault line between the Hindu Tamils and the Buddhist Sinhalese, and most of the country are Sinhalese. The Tamils are like 20%. The Sinhalese were using politics to just oppress the Tamils so terribly that it turned into a civil war. And the civil war went on for about 25 years and wound up killing, nobody knows, but well over 100,000 people in this very nasty civil war. And the best writing about that civil war, I'm just rambling on about a few interesting things about the country, is, I'm not going to say he's a friend of mine, but we had dinner together. The war nerd, anybody out there, if they Google the war nerd, his name is John Rowland, and he was a university professor from University, I think, in Berkeley. Very, very left-wing, excellent writer about military affairs. So he's done some of the best writing about the long war between the Tamils and the Sinhalese. So just one thing and another. A couple other anecdotes about Sri Lanka is when this they had a tsunami in 2004, and I forget if the 2004 one was the big one that we all heard about, or if that was a previous one. But it turns out that when they had a 2004 tsunami, 30,000 people were killed and 500,000 people were displaced and lost their homes. And it's like we're wandering around in the mud. So this place has kind of wandered from one disaster to another. And meanwhile, since World War II and the place becoming independent, the population has gone from around 4 million to around 22 million. They've exported a lot of people too. And so you ask yourself, you wonder, how is it that a place which is desperately poor and suffering from all these problems and political disasters and governments that run it like a feudal kingdom, not even people's republics or socialist dictatorships, even worse, how does the population manage to expand at that rate? Where's the money come from? Where's the food come from to feed them? It's all crazy. Anyway, I'm sorry to have just gone on about it.
Oh, that's fantastic. There's a lot there that I had no idea of. When I saw, I don't have much knowledge of Sri Lanka. I only met one person who was from, tangentially related to this ruling family, actually. And life for him 5 years ago was certainly extremely good, full of extremely good opportunities in that country because of his connections there. He encouraged me and friends of mine to come and visit him. But the thing that you see that's happening there now, I mean, I guess the thing that brings us to my attention today is the fact that it has been, and it's been falling apart very quickly over about the last 6 weeks. I mean, I think about 6 weeks ago was the first time I heard that they were having difficulty getting fuel in country. That they basically did not have enough dollars on hand in order to be able to buy the fuel. And things have been cascading from there, from worse and worse, with prices going up and basically everything sort of falling apart. And basically it's kind of gone into almost riot conditions now, where they have burned, last I heard was something like 35 prominent members of the government, their homes. I just showed you the video where they burned the car collection of the prime minister's family, which is kind of really rubbing in their face when you got a whole garage full of Ferraris and Lambos. It's probably not great to rub that in people's faces like that. But so they burned all those, threw a bunch of them in the water. There's lots of videos of them doing that sort of thing, and really just chasing down politicians and beating them. And from what I saw, last headline I saw about it, that there were reported that there were 200 people killed so far. That was as of yesterday. So it's getting violent, and I think that's we know that rising food prices led to the Arab Spring. We know now that food prices are higher than they were at that time. And it's a much broader global phenomenon now, where the stresses seem greater, especially on the trailing edge of the COVID nonsense, where everybody was locked down, economies suffered drastically during that period. And so the fragility of this country, I think maybe it was one of the first to break, but I suspect it won't be the last. And I have a couple of other examples that I could show just very quickly as well. But with Iran, for example, is one, and then also Tajikistan, food riots in both of those places reported in the last 48 hours. So things are starting to fray. And one of the interesting things, go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, that's all very good. And incidentally, one thing that is very hard to discover and doesn't come out is that last year in 2021, the government decided that it would be good for Sri Lanka to produce everything organically. So they made it illegal to have imported fertilizers or pesticides. And of course, crop production collapsed, and food riots in the city, as well as on the tea plantations where they don't grow anything but tea, so there's no other food. I mean, this is a country that, like all of these shitholes, is destroyed by its own government. And
Yes.
and when you listen to the leading lights of the country of Sri Lanka talk about, well, what should be done to solve this chaos? Well, they all admit they're in chaos, but their solutions are just a different government and reform and more loans from the IMF, and all their solutions are government solutions, or where, well, we tried this kind of socialism, let's try that kind of socialism.
Right.
So this place is hopeless. I mean, my question is, and you're talking about Tajikistan and where?
Iran.
So the question is that the populations of places like this that have it societally ingrained that you have a leader and you follow the leader blindly, like this current president was elected by a gigantic margin a couple of years ago because he promised to turn the place into a paradise and so forth. And of course, all these stupid people believe it. And of course, I don't see any way out of it. We're dealing with, in effect, chimpanzees. I'm afraid that Giant Bandari is right. It's not just Sri Lanka. It's the average person everywhere. Doesn't have an IQ of even 100. They've got an IQ of 80 because they keep doing the same stupid things all over. It's like a psychological aberration that cannot be.
Well, one of the interesting things is most of what you hear from governments is just lies. You never really get. They avoid leveling with the people for as long as possible, and so you don't really get a good glimpse at the extent of the damage that's been done often. But I think because this new prime minister is coming in, of course appointed by the old powers, so he's like he was tapped by the current president essentially to fill the role. He's the same as they are, but coming in there, he's I think trying to level with the people more about exactly how dire the situation is. Because when they're killing politicians and destroying their homes, at this point, you might as well just deal with the truth. And so we get a glimpse.
Yeah, and his speech that you reproduced is actually quite candid and interesting, and impresses me as honest. He's talking about selling the national airline to a foreign buyer, and what is the price? What are they losing? It turns out the Sri Lankan rupee, the SLR, which it lists there, is worth about. It's trading for about 360 to the dollar. So typically, I think he gives numbers. Yes, total loss was
45 billion rupee.
Yeah, 45 billion rupees. So divide that by 360 or 400. So how much is it losing a year? $100 million?
Yeah, well, it does say by the 31st of March 2021, the total loss was at 372 billion rupees. So, yeah.
Okay, so divide 372 billion, 37 million, 3.7. I guess that's like $100 million, roughly.
Well, and when you can't put together $1 million to get some petrol in the country, and when they have two oil tankers that have been sort of docked off the coast waiting to unload, but they can't come up with the currency to be able to pay those. That's a huge amount of money. It's a huge amount of money. So let's go through this a little bit and just talk about some of the disastrous situations that they're in, because it is interesting. And the first thing that stood out, as I started with, is that their foreign reserves were in a decent position. It sounds like back in November of 2019. This is pre-COVID, with $7.5 billion. Now they can't even get together $1 million, and specifically they're trying to quickly as possible raise $5 million that they need in order to be able to import some desperately needed gas into the country. So their dollar reserves are in terrible condition. And if people wonder why the dollar has gained so much strength in the last month in particular, like Sri Lanka gives you a perfect example of that. I mean, in order for them to buy the basic commodities, the basic things they need for life to function, they need dollars. They don't have dollars, and so the country has fallen completely apart in a relatively short period of time.
Yes, that's right. And I guess the fact that they put a ban on fertilizers and pesticides had part of that, because they would have had to have imported lots of other food, or they would have had gigantic food riots as well. So these people stumble from one disaster to another, where these bureaucrats, after they've stolen all that they can themselves, make stupid laws telling the people that the laws are going to make things better. It's the problem with these countries is the state itself. Everybody all over the world, and this is true not just of these nothing nowhere countries. It's true of Europe and the U.S. and Canada and everywhere. It's that everybody believes that government is the solution, when they don't realize that it's their greatest enemy. But I don't think we can turn the situation around, quite frankly. It's like it's part of the human psychology at this point. Yeah, the problem really is the state itself. I mean, a place like Sri Lanka could be a garden island. The whole world, the whole planet could be a garden planet. But every distortion, every problem that we encounter, just about, if it's not created by the state itself, it's amplified by the state. And meanwhile, what do people try to do? They think that changing the state will improve things. Meanwhile, the state is growing like Topsy. I mean, since the beginning of the 20th century, the average government anywhere in the world was trivial. It was a minor nuisance. 5, at most 10% of the GDP of a country was controlled by the government. Now, everywhere, it's 50% or more. Places like Sri Lanka, it's much, much more. So
well, and the government seems to be involved in everything. Of course, we talked about that they had the national airline that they're want to privatize, but every infrastructure company they mention in this speech is a state-owned company. So whether it be the electric company or the oil company, it's all state-owned stuff. And
yeah, but does he actually say? He says they're going to privatize it, but what foreign investor will pay any reasonable money for this stuff, because he knows that he's dealing with crazy chimpanzees that are going to tax and regulate and make it impossible and nationalize it again eventually.
Yeah, that's right. I don't think anyone will be interested in buying it. And I mean, the biggest thing they need to do is they need to stop the bleeding of the expenses of it that they're running so unprofitably. So they may just, my guess is it'll probably just collapse and they'll stop making payments and servicing it, and they won't be able to find a private buyer for quite a while. But at this point, their lifeline has been India. Like, India has given them some loans that's enabled them to actually import a little bit more fuel, because they only have enough fuel today, apparently, to last one more day. Most of their electricity is generated through oil. These oil tankers have been kind of parked outside of the port, waiting for money from India. They need $20 million in order to be able to get it in. And if without that, they say they're going to have to ramp up the daily power outages to 15 hours a day. That's what they have to do. So everything is collapsing there.
Right. I mean, they're not going to be able to work their tea plantations. The farmers aren't going to have these little handheld tractors anymore to grow things. They can't import, if they can't, if it was legal again, import fertilizers again. So, it's possible, I think, for a civilization to collapse totally. I mean, absolutely. I mean, where these people could actually be grubbing for roots and berries, and the population of Sri Lanka could fall from 22 million down to a couple million
Right.
in a matter of a couple of years if the outside world stops shipping stuff to them. I mean,
Right.
anything could happen.
Well, and it does seem like we're entering that era where where there won't be outside forces able to come in and rescue you constantly, because we saw the other day that India, one of the largest swing wheat producers, announced that they will no longer, that they're banning all exports of wheat. So if they're doing that, and lots of other countries have done this before them in this current period. So it makes you look at, I mean, people are trying to protect their own at this point, it appears. So a couple of things that are interesting about what's going on there. They don't have enough medicines. So because they say payments have not been made for 4 months to suppliers of the medicine, medical equipment, and food for patients. So basically, the state-owned pharmaceutical corporation has stiffed suppliers for the last 4 months. So those pharmaceutical companies are blacklisting the state pharmaceutical corporation from any further business activities. So another thing the state sort of screws up.
Yeah, no more aspirin for you, but forget about aspirin. No more penicillin or anything else.
Yeah, they mentioned specifically two that seem very critical. They say are heart disease medication and anti-rabies vaccine.
Interesting.
As a key one, like how prevalent is rabies in Sri Lanka?
I wonder if they produce their own snake bite medicine also, because here's an interesting factet for you, is about 10,000 people a year die of venomous snake bites in India. That's quite a few, actually. And I presume it's proportionate in Sri Lanka too. And you need venom to treat that, or it's going to be more. Anyway.
Well, one of the interesting things the government's doing there that shows how fragile this activity makes things very fragile. And that is that they say at present, the government incurs a loss of 84 rupees per liter of petrol. And for diesel, it's 131 rupees per liter of diesel. Essentially, it's all subsidized by the Petroleum Corporation, who can no longer bear that loss on behalf of its citizens.
Yeah, exactly. And on top of that, well, they have to get rid of these subsidies and make it a free market, obviously. That's one thing. But as soon as they get rid of those subsidies, the price of the petrol is going to go up, and the poor people are...
They're going to set more stuff on fire.
Yeah. So they have an advanced road system and lots of cars and trucks in Sri Lanka, but could they all stop running if the outer world stops sending them free stuff?
It seems clear that it will. I mean, so they have no dollars, and even their state companies they talk about in here don't even have rupees. And so this new prime minister says, to his chagrin, essentially, against my own wishes, he says, I'm compelled to permit printing money in order to pay state sector employees and pay for essential goods and services.
And I don't have the figures on this, but my suspicion is that a huge number of people work for the state. For instance, I did look it up, and it appears that there are 300,000 members of the Sri Lankan army alone. I don't know if that includes their Air Force and their Navy, but out of a country of 22 million, it's not at war with anybody. They don't do foreign adventures the way the US does. 300,000 people in the military will serve no useful purpose. At least people ought to be doing something productive with their lives.
Well, now I think they're trying to, the politicians find them useful because they're the one thing separating the angry mobs from them.
Yeah, and it is nice. One sign that maybe I'm overdoing the fact that Giant Bhandari is right about his countrymen is that the mobs burn down politicians' houses. Instead of, in the US, at least in the past, mobs always used to burn down their own neighborhoods. So things got worse for them where they live, but at least they ranged out and burned down the politicians' houses. But why they didn't hang the politicians while they were at it? I
Well,
don't.
I think things are escalating. Last, I did see some. I saw some footage of the president and his family hopping into a military helicopter and doing the Saigon exit, essentially. So, I mean, they must have sensed that it was becoming very dangerous for them to be there.
Yeah, I would not want to fly Sri Lankan Airlines at this point because if they can't even afford fuel for planes, I promise you, there's huge deferred maintenance on those jets or even flying in the
Oh,
future.
no doubt. No doubt. So, Doug, one of the things that we started this call with was the idea that this might be a preview of the future, maybe in a neighborhood near you. Why do you think that? Why do you think Sri Lanka is really is an example of something that will spread globally? And if so, why?
That's a good point, Matt, because it's a microcosm. It's a microcosm. It's an island. And so we can see on a small scale what could happen all over the world because the world itself suffers from the same problems as Sri Lanka does.
Hmm.
And the few productive parts of the world are actually being closed down with things like the Biden regime in the US. These people have the same psychological makeup as the Soviets did or the Cultural Revolution Chinese did. It's happening in Canada. It's happening all over Western Europe. So if it's like a scene out of Atlas Shrugged, where if the parts of the world that actually produce things and create things stop doing it, well, the whole thing will fall apart. And the world's population has grown over the years through prosperity. But if the prosperity comes to an end for these reasons, I mean, the world's population, forget about leveling out at 10 billion or whatever the number is, it could collapse overnight to, or a few years to 2 billion. We'll have to see what happens in Sri Lanka. Is their population going to collapse? Because at this point, they can't even export people because their planes don't fly.
The number one export besides tea is not even working anymore. That's interesting. Yeah.
So how many more countries will get themselves into the same predicament? And then the IMF is going to what? Ship them more money because the IMF doesn't create anything.
I mean, but I think one of the, so let's talk about the unique characters of Sri Lanka that might give us a clue as to other countries that could suffer this fate. I think some of the things that are interesting about it, they do subsidize a lot of things for their people. So they basically they're using the country's balance sheet in order to subsidize industry for people, which makes them very exposed if they're subsidizing things that come from the dollar market. So specifically petroleum, which has gone up a lot. So if you're importing petroleum and you're subsidizing that for your people, I think that puts you at great risk. That alone is one characteristic that could put you over the edge. And also, if you're doing the same thing for food, I think that'd be the same sort of thing. And there are a lot of countries, I think, that meet that standard, aren't there?
Yes, there are. This is actually quite a study that we could make of what countries are most likely to collapse and where will the collapse be worse when it happens. But maybe Sri Lanka is one of the most interesting ones to watch because it's an island and you need fuel to get to the island to start with.
Or
It
to get
doesn't.
off of it.
Yeah, and the fact is that the place has for decades and decades has been a hotbed of racial and religious violence mainly between the Sinhalese and the Tamils, and that's apparently heating up at this point, and for good reason. And
Yeah.
similar to what happens in a multicultural domestic empire like the U.S., where race hatred is being actively fomented by a
Actively
lot.
fomented. I agree. I was just looking at. I saw some note about Sri Lanka's debt, and they do have, of course, lots of dollar-denominated debt, and their they're currently in their grace period for missing a bond payment, but that actually expires on May 18th, so tomorrow. So they will probably be officially defaulted tomorrow. So I think one of the early indicators of countries that are probably suffering from this dollar shortage because and then inability to get the resources they need are going to be people who are missing their bond payments, obviously, which is always an early sign.
And we'll have to see who the bonds are due to, and are they bonds are, technically speaking, a bond is supposed to have some specific asset that the money is lent against. And most of these things are actually debentures, which are just kind of like generalized loans, not secured by any specific asset. So I'd like to know what the nature of that Sri Lankan debt is like some of it to General Motors Corporation for the import of their cars. I don't know.
Good question. Yeah, I'll do some digging on this to see what I can find out. But in any case, shortage of dollars is proving deadly, I think, to countries like this. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what happens there. But I do think that this is. I think the dynamics are the dependence on dollars, the shortage of dollars in these countries, the huge rise in the prices of food and fuel, bad management for long periods of time from all governments. I mean, I don't know if we can find an example of a government's actually doing an excellent job running anything. So you have to almost assume it's going to be poor. That combination of all that stuff seems to end in fire. And that's what we're seeing there. And we're seeing the same thing in Tajikistan, Iran. We saw in, I think it was Peru earlier last month. We saw some stuff in Peru. And I think that even Pakistan had some trouble last month as well. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what happens next.
Yeah, this could happen all over the world, and especially these poor countries. I'll bet it'll happen in Egypt too,
Yeah.
which still has a rapidly growing population, and most of their income is foreign welfare from the IMF and governments like the U.S. I guess Ukraine is our biggest foreign welfare stooge at this point, but it used to be we gave more money to Israel and Egypt than any other two countries. I guess it's bribery to keep them from fighting each other. I mean, I don't care. Not my problem. Okay, I wish them both well, but I wouldn't pay them not to fight. So Egypt, they import huge amounts of grain, import huge amounts of fuel, rapidly growing population, and don't produce anything except tourism revenue, quite frankly. So this could be, mass starvation in a place like that. And of course, if I was an Egyptian, or if I was anybody in Africa or the Middle East, I'd try to get to Europe as soon as I could because they're rich and soft and stupid. And what are they going to do when you arrive there? It's like on the U.S. border, and I heard it said the other day that immigration, or migration is more accurate, from across the Rio Grande is going to reach 500,000 per month.
Wow.
That's an unbelievable number. Now, where do you put all those people? They cross the border. They're basically penniless, carrying the clothes on their back. What do you do with those people? Where do they go? I mean, that's more than they can just ship off in a few plane loads to, be the problem of some local city someplace. I mean, these are massive refugee camps that are going to build up.
Right. And as you see the costs going up in every country, the basic costs of food and fuel, those going up, you see the stability in the countries, these third world countries deteriorating. Mass migration is going to be potentially like something we have never seen before, not just of course in North America, but I think also in Europe, which has already been hammered by it over the last decade. So it could get really crazy, Doug. This year is going to be exciting. It really is.
It's going to be scary exciting. And there's no reason to believe that the year after that is going to be any better, because these people are not going to come up with intelligent solutions. Instead, they're going to look for a man on a white horse that will claim to, like like the idiot that
Like
was
this, in,
elected in Sri Lanka will promise the moon to these people. They'll believe it, and they'll say, "Just give me more power so I can make sure I can do all these wonderful things for you." And it'll happen in the U.S., Canada, Europe, everywhere.
yeah, here's his promise to the people at the end of his speech. We will build a nation without queues for kerosene, gas, and fuel, a nation free of power outages, a nation with plentiful resources where agriculture can freely flourish, a nation where the future of the youth is secure, a nation where people's labor need not be wasted in queues and in struggles, a nation where everyone can lead their lives freely with 3 square meals a day.
Obviously, they need yet a different type of socialism to make all these things possible.
Exactly. One that involves fewer queues, apparently, because that seems to be the big complaint. The queues.
That's a law they forgot to make. Fewer queues. Make it so.
Now, exactly. Effective immediately, no more queues. Yeah, that's okay. Well, we'll see what happens with this. But Doug, if you were to guess, what country would be next? Which country we might next see people burning politicians' homes in? What might that be? Like,
Mm.
that's a pretty clear test, I think, would be take it out directly on the politicians.
Yeah. Well, of course, that is it warms the cockles of my heart to see that happen.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, during the French Revolution, they were doing that kind of thing too, executing.
That's where it started.
Yeah, the nobility, but people are like cockroaches. I mean, they manage to survive and recover. And I keep going back to this: if people could survive during the battle for Stalingrad and the battle for Berlin, then they could survive and rebuild and come back. And Hiroshima could come back from being totally flattened to. So perhaps we shouldn't be so gloomy. But wouldn't have been any fun at the time when those things were happening.
No.
It could happen all around the world.
Yeah, and I don't think they're being that gloomy about it. I'm just saying, to me, the biggest thing is that people seem to think that danger is very far away from them at all times, and I feel like that people have really underestimated the difficulties that we will face, that everyone around the world is going to face over the next decade. I think people drastically underestimate. They see something like Sri Lanka, if they even see it in the news, they think, where is that weird place? It's so backward. It would never be like that here where I live. And I think that the stage is set for this to occur potentially anywhere in the world at this point. I mean, anywhere.
And it could be actually more serious in an advanced industrial country where we have supply lines that we're not living as close to the ground the way those people in Sri Lanka are. So a lot more stuff can go wrong in an advanced industrial society if these people screw it up in Washington. And of course they will.
Well, for instance, the fact that actually, let me just show one more article just to talk about the potential risks of this in the US, and then we'll wrap it up. But real quick, find this. Oh, geez, did I just close it? I think I just closed it. Anyway, it was a Bloomberg article basically talking about the fuel shortages, gasoline and diesel shortages in the US, that we do not have the ability, the capacity to produce for our own needs, to refine the fuels for our own needs. And we are currently exporting at a record amount, diesel fuel in particular, to Europe. And the amount of, right now, the inventories of diesel are at an all-time low in the Eastern Seaboard especially, and could run dry in as soon as a week, where diesel is just simply not available, or at least will be rationed as soon as next week. And I think that imagine that all the trucks that bring in the food in New York City and Philadelphia, that they can't run. Imagine that the trains and everything else that moves around there, they can't move. The flights not being able to fly out of JFK or Newark because they can't get the fuel they need. I mean, like things can get really hairy very fast if we simply just do not have one of the key components of a functioning modern society. And we're very close.
It's true. And interestingly, it's that so much of our petroleum production in the US since the fracking revolution is very light, sweet crude, and diesel and kerosene are heavy distillates. So it's good for gasoline, but not so good for diesel. So diesel is more valuable from a domestic production point of view because of the kind of oil that we now produce. This is all very, very strange, what's going on in the world today.
It is. It is. Okay. Well, I think we'll leave it there for today, Doug, but we'll keep people updated if we see anything interesting happening in Sri Lanka and start to see this. This might be the citizens sort of revolting among their the leadership that have screwed stuff up. Could be the new pandemic that sweeps around the globe.
Yes. Well, the leadership will have to keep the peasants in place if that happens. So if anybody's got any thoughts or contributions or questions, I hope they submit them and we can talk about them on Friday.
Yes, absolutely. All right, Doug, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Matt.